Tonight on Primetime Politics, wait and see.
We're going to see how this plays out.
The Prime Minister says nothing is off the table, but for now he's not looking for a fight, waiting to see how Premier Danielle Smith's Sovereignty Act will play out. We'll get some reaction from members of Parliament and look at the politics behind the legislation. And the Bank of Canada posts its first loss in its 87-year history. What impact will that have on federal coffers? This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Premier Danielle Smith's Sovereignty Act has now passed first reading. Introduced yesterday in the Alberta throne speech, under this legislation, provincial cabinet would have the ability to direct organizations in Alberta to ignore any policy or federal mandate they decided harmful to the province. And in justifying the act, the Premier points to the Prime Minister, accusing him of being harmful to Alberta and its people. But Justin Trudeau is not reacting, at least not yet. Take a listen.
We're going to focus on delivering for Albertans the way we have. We know that the exceptional powers that the Premier is choosing to give the Alberta government in bypassing the Alberta legislature is causing a lot of eyebrows to raise in Alberta, and we're going to see how this plays out. I'm not going to take anything off the table, but I'm also not looking for a fight. We want to continue to be there to deliver for Albertans. There's going to be things that we agree with that government on. There's going to be things we disagree with them on. And my focus is always going to be constructive in terms of delivering for people right across the country.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister from earlier today. Now, for more reaction to Premier Smith's Sovereignty Act, we're now joined by two members of Parliament. Arif Virani is the Liberal member for the riding of Parkdale High Park in Toronto. He's also the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of International Trade. And Blake Desjarlais is the NDP member of Parliament for the riding of Edmonton-Griesbach. Hello to both of you.
Hi there. Hey, Michael.
Mr. Virani, you know, the Prime Minister says he's not looking for a fight with Alberta. He's going to wait and see. Is that because he believes this will not survive a court challenge?
Well, I think it's a bit premature, in fairness, to talk about a court challenge. What we have is something that was introduced in the Alberta legislature today at first reading. It hasn't even passed the legislature, and even if it does pass the legislature, it still requires some action or motion to be moved by a cabinet minister to trigger something under this potential legislation. I think what's important, as the Prime Minister is emphasizing, is that we deal with Albertans the way we deal with every other part of the country. We're trying to address people's needs. And in Alberta, we've had constructive discussions and dialogue and cooperation even on things like the childcare legislation that we put forward, that Jason Kenney cooperated with us on, things like hydrogen, green hydrogen, carbon capture. These types of things I think are important to Albertans, and they're important to all Canadians, and that's what we're focused on right now.
Okay, that's your focus. Mr. Desjarlais, I'm wondering from your perspective, as an Albertan, what do you think of what's being proposed here?
Well, I think, Michael, what Albertans are used to in many ways is this kind of adversarial approach to Ottawa. You know, it's not far out to suggest that Albertans have in fact seen over the period of time some resistance to some of the issues that matter most to Albertans. But what we're seeing with Danielle Smith is something far different than that. We're seeing very drastic overreach and extreme pushback, and it's hurting Albertans today. That's really my belief, and it's what I hear on the doors. I know that this is not top of mind for Albertans. Albertans would have liked to see a plan from their Premier that looked and addressed at the healthcare crisis we're facing in our province. People are lined up right now in the Calgary hospital. Some kids are waiting 20 hours just to see a physician. Kids who are sick at home have no access to the medicine they need, and what they're seeing from their Premier isn't the kind of leadership that people would expect. People would expect a leader that actually addresses the needs of Albertans, and that's not what we're seeing right now. Now,
Mr. Virani, I know you say it's too early to talk about any type of court challenge, but you know, Premier Smith has been very open about this. She argues that this act only ensures the separation of powers and responsibilities between provinces and the federal government. It really is guaranteed by the Constitution, and she points to what she sees as federal overreach in programs like national childcare. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say that obviously her government, or the predecessor leader of the government of Alberta, signed an agreement with us with respect to childcare. We do not feel that we have usurped our jurisdiction or exceeded our jurisdiction. But I also point out, I mean, Michael, I used to practice law in this specific area of the division of powers and the Charter of Rights, and we know that there are venues for challenging constitutionality of provisions. Those venues are the courts. It's important that it remains that way. So it's not for the Premier of Alberta or any federal government elected leader to opine on constitutionality. That's for courts to verify. We just think it's a little bit premature to be opining upon that. Obviously, you know, it's important that Blake just highlighted healthcare. Healthcare is a pressing matter. It's also a matter of shared jurisdiction. We have a Canada Health Act. We ensure that the principles of the Canada Health Act are adhered to, and that's an important facet of how our federation operates, and that's something that we'd like to be working with Albertans and other premiers on, and that's the type of thing that I think people are really more concerned about, rather than what seems to be a fairly symbolic gesture, and just really just that.
But I wonder if you're concerned about the language that's being used here, because in justifying this act, the Premier has said that the Trudeau government has been disrespectful of Alberta and Albertans. She argues the government has crossed jurisdictional lines, have stood in the way of the province's oil industry, ignored the province's concerns over transfer payments. So I appreciate what you're saying, but certainly the language around this being used to justify it points to your government.
And I've heard the language, and obviously different premiers will employ different languages, and obviously she's speaking to Albertans and perhaps her base in terms of utilizing that type of language. But I'll say to you that, you know, there have been instances where grievances have been raised about potential constitutional overreach by the federal government. The most recent example is actually when the Alberta government joined with a few others around the country and challenged our price on pollution. That went to the Supreme Court of Canada. That's the most appropriate venue. It ruled unanimously in favor of the federal government, exercising rightful jurisdiction to address what is a pressing national issue, which is climate change and environmental pollution. So we have fora for these disputes. Those fora are the courts. That's where constitutional matters are meant to be determined, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it should be. In terms of Premier Smith, I mean, I'd encourage you to reach out to her directly about the type of language she's using. We want to have a productive dialogue with MPs, such as Blake from the province of Alberta, but also with the provincial government of Alberta itself, because that's to the benefit of those Albertan Canadians.
Blake, what do you say to the language that's being used here, or at least the arguments being used, in terms of pointing to Ottawa as ignoring the province, ignoring Albertans, and again, ignoring issues like federal transfer payments?
Well, I think it's a convenient and easy distraction for Albertans that have just seen one of the worst experiences as Albertans reeled with the results of COVID under leadership of former Premier Kenney. And so for her, she's going to have a really interesting pitch to Albertans to actually find a way to change the dial on Jason Kenney's deplorable actions in the province, and especially the underfunding of our public healthcare system. So I think in one way the language is a distraction for folks, but to be more explicit, we've seen from other Indigenous groups across the province, my relatives from Treaty 6 to Treaty 7 to Treaty 8, unanimously denounced the language found in the Act because of its overreach and its threat to treaty rights in the province. And so I think what we're seeing, one is the threat to treaty rights in that language, and then two, I think a really big concern within the language is the perspectives of democracy and the rule of law being upheld in our province. When we're talking about those two incredibly important principles, and we see the language of the ministers being able to go in, or the Premier into the province of Alberta, and go into the House and declare something unconstitutional, and then simply have it read as unconstitutional for the purpose of the minister to then direct other bodies and agencies like police to ignore federal laws. This is an egregious attack on the rule of law and democracy in Alberta, and I do believe that we need to find ways to ensure that treaty rights and the rights of Albertans aren't trampled on.
Okay, I've got less than a minute, and so forgive me, Mr. Virani, we're going to stay here with Mr. Desjarlais, because I wonder, as someone from Alberta, the province has an election in 6 months. Do you think Danielle Smith will gain any political points with this act?
No. I believe that what she's done for Albertans is further polarize Albertans in a time when we need unity. We need a province and we need a leader that truly recognizes Albertans and where they're at. We need to recognize that rural Alberta and urban Alberta are in fact part of the same province, and that we can in fact have a united province of Alberta. And her language and what she's doing is further dividing Albertans. You might have seen recently, she failed to run in the empty seat in Calgary because it was an urban riding. She told Calgarians that they weren't worth representing. And so she called a by-election elsewhere in Medicine Hat, a rural seat where she could win. What does that say to urban ridings in the province of Alberta? What does that say to Calgarians when someone that they expect to be premier in the short few months back when she was running wasn't able or wasn't willing to run in an urban center like Calgary? It speaks to a party that can't unite.
Blake Desjarlais, Arif Virani, thank you very much for the time today. Appreciate your thoughts on the matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to note that we did invite the Conservative Party to take part in today's panel, but our request went unanswered. But Conservative MP Gerard Deltel was asked about the Alberta Sovereignty Act today, and this is how he responded.
5 different Parti Québécois government achieved great things for Quebec. So yes, you can achieve great things for your province inside the Confederation, as long as you respect your jurisdiction. That's what happened in Quebec, and I think each and every province can get inspirational from that inside Canada as a proud Canadian.
Well, with more on Premier Smith's Sovereignty Act, we're now joined by Jen Gerson, political commentator and co-founder of The Line. Jen, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Listen, I want to begin with your impressions here. What do you make of this act so far? Because on the one hand, the title has been watered down because it's no longer just the Alberta Sovereignty Act. But on the other hand, it also seems to propose greater powers to ignore federal programs and mandates. So overall, what do you make of what you've heard so far?
I mean, my first impression was just disdain and laughter, like just a lot of guffawing and going, what in the world is this? So I think that there are 2 issues with this bill, and they're 2 slightly separate issues. The one is, of course, the legal theory that is going on inside the legislation itself. And I use the word theory pretty lightly because it's borderline Freeman on land stuff. And then the other issue is the political implication of what is being attempted through this legislation. Now, that is a little bit more interesting. So it's hard to tell right now whether or not the Sovereignty Act within a united Canada is really the dumbest piece of legislation or the most brilliant political tactic one could possibly imagine.
Okay, let's break that up and first begin with the legal argument, because to hear it from Premier Smith, she argues that really what this act does is reinforce the divisions of power and jurisdictions as outlined in the Constitution. And there is this question as to whether or not it would actually survive a court challenge.
Okay, so the problem with a type of Sovereignty Act type thing is that it's either redundant or it's unconstitutional. Either you're just passing a piece of legislation that reaffirms constitutional jurisdiction, which is fine, but why? We already have that in the Constitution. Or you're creating a new set of laws that would be inherently constitutional because it would override that Constitution. And the weird thing about the Sovereignty Act is that it kind of tries to do both. It's very bizarre. So what the Sovereignty Act is trying to do is it's trying to say, look, in a normal confederated system, the federal government or a provincial government passes a law and maybe there's some dispute about whether or not it's encroaching in another order of government's jurisdictional space. In an ordinary time, what you would do is the aggrieved party would then take that order of government to court. A court could pass an injunction and say, we're going to suspend this legislation or suspend these regulations until we can actually decide on this. And then the court, it would go through a court testing process for the court to decide which order of government such a regulation or law appropriately belonged to. Fine, great, we've done that. We've seen that play before. We saw it last with, like, for example, the Carbon Tax Act, right? Like, federal government passes a law, provinces say this is our jurisdiction, it goes through the court process says federal government can pass this. So there's all kinds of contested areas like this. And one of these areas that is very grave, for example, is in criminal law. Remember, for example, when British Columbia said, we are not going to enforce laws against marijuana dispensaries. Mm-hmm. Well, that was in violation of the constitutional right of the federal government to impose criminal law on marijuana. Mm-hmm. So we do see some gray area here. But what this law is attempting to do is it's trying to short circuit that legal process and that seeking an injunction process and saying, no, if we think something's not constitutional, we are going to put the authority to enforce it back into the provincial cabinet So instead of going to court and seeking an injunction, we're just going to say that this is unconstitutional, and we're going to say that the federal cabinet can just not enforce it.
Which is why. Sorry, continue.
So that they then don't have to go through the hassle of the legal process, hypothetically, of trying to assert provincial jurisdictional authority. Of course, provinces can't do that. That's not how the system works, and that's why what is being proposed here is unconstitutional, and why it has almost no chance of surviving a constitutional challenge. The first time this act is actually invoked or somebody tries to use it, it will be subject to a constitutional challenge, and it will lose.
Which many people are pointing to already, the fact that it will be almost guaranteed challenged in court and not survive. Yeah. That said, that presupposes a verdict, but you also point to the fact that this could be political brilliance. And I was wondering about the kind of political calculation behind introducing and moving forward with this kind of act in Alberta.
Okay, there's two sort of political gambits here. There's what the legislation actually says. Let's put that aside for a moment, because let's just accept that that's banana crackers. Then there's the political gambit. The political gambit here is that Danielle Smith is coming out to her base and saying, look, I'm being aggressive on Ottawa. I'm taking the fight to Ottawa. I'm being assertive on these issues. We are an aggrieved party. And look at me, I'm being tough. And even if the thing is struck down in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years by the Supreme Court, doesn't matter, because she's thinking, by then I've already won the next election, and we'll have moved on to the next issue. The second thing she's thinking is that even if the Supreme Court does strike it down, she can then use that as an argument to say, Alberta is getting an unfair deal from Confederation. We are subject to particular discrimination. How come we can't do this and all these other provinces can engage in all this kind of chicanery? Well, we're clearly the aggrieved party of Canada. And of course, this can then be parlayed into a grievance politics that has always served conservative governments, and particularly the UCP in this province. So it's purely for domestic political purposes. The other question here is, to what extent is she trying to goad the federal government into overstepping or doing something intemperate, as I've heard it said? Well,
it's interesting because we already heard the Prime Minister says that he's not looking to have a fight over the Sovereignty Act, that he's going to take this wait-and-see attitude.
And that's really smart, because the worst thing that he could do would be to say, I'm going to invoke disallowance and not allow this law to pass, because Smith would then come around and say, look, Justin Trudeau is trying to meddle in our affairs once again. We are the aggrieved province in Alberta. That will play very, very well for her domestically within the Alberta electorate. So essentially, it's a giant game of, I talked to Ian Holloway, who's the Dean of Law School here at University of Calgary, and he's like, look, this is a game of chicken. This isn't legislation. It's a game of chicken. That's all that this is. She's trying to force Twitter to freak out. She's trying to force the NDP opposition leader, Rachel Notley, to come out against Alberta's Sovereignty Act. And she's seeded just enough nonsense in the legislation itself to try and make it seem palatable to more moderate UCP leaders. So it's the dumbest piece of legislation, but it might be very smart politics.
Well, we are watching. Jen, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for the insight.
Anytime.
And a closing note, 2 hours after the Sovereignty Act was referenced in the throne speech, Jason Kenney resigned his seat in the Alberta legislature. Kenney was a federal cabinet minister and is Premier Smith's immediate predecessor. He was also been a staunch critic of the act, and in resigning, he cited concerns about the political polarization that he sees happening in this country, both in left and right politics. His resignation as MLA was effective immediately. Well, we were told it was coming, and now we know the figure. A $522 million loss for the Bank of Canada in the third quarter, the result of its quantitative easing policy and its own decision to hike interest rates. Take a listen to the Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem as he gave his assessment of the situation.
After a period of above-average income, our net interest income is now turning negative. Following a period of losses, the Bank of Canada will return to positive net earnings. The size and duration of the losses will ultimately depend on a number of factors. These include, in particular, the path for interest rates, as well as the evolution of the economy and the balance sheet. The losses do not affect our ability to conduct monetary policy.
With more on the Bank of Canada's third quarter loss, we're now joined by Pedro Antunes. Mr. Antunes is the Chief Economist for the Conference Board of Canada. Mr. Antunes, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Canada's central bank, we should say right off top, not the only national institution posting these huge losses, but how troubling is it for the bank? How unique is it for the bank to be reporting this loss of $522 million?
Yeah, no, that's over essentially the last quarter, quarter three. And it is unusual because typically the bank is a lender of last resort and it actually has assets that earn interest. And on a net basis, it earns a net income. And that income is essentially, as far as I know, has been positive for the last 30 years at least. And that is given, in essence, on a regular basis to the federal government. So it goes into the federal government's, general revenues in terms of its budget planning, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Which I'll get to in a moment, but I think it's worthwhile to help people understand just how we got here. What exactly did the Bank of Canada do to get to this point where they're looking at this loss, again, for the very first time in decades?
Well, it's a combination of two things, really. As you know, during the pandemic, the Bank of Canada wanted to inject a lot of liquidity into the system. And what that means is essentially the Bank of Canada can, essentially print money, if you'd like, in a way that enables it to purchase assets. And the assets it purchased were bonds, Government of Canada bonds, provincial bonds. It even got involved into corporate bonds and mortgage bonds to try and get as much liquidity out there as possible in a time of crisis where people really didn't know if the financial system would seize in a situation where we were closing down the economy. So the bank, I think, acted in a very responsible way, very quickly, to try and ensure that we kept the economy flowing through that very tough time. But what that means now is that the bank is now holding a lot of these assets that are essentially Government of Canada 10-year bonds that are paying 0.5% or less, while its interest rate that it pays on deposits that mostly chartered banks have with the Bank of Canada have gone up because, of course, the bank, since March, has raised short-term rates very quickly. So it's the difference between those two that is essentially gone from a net positive historically to all of a sudden a net negative.
Well, and I think that's a bit of the irony here, isn't it? In that part of the bank's problem is its very own policy to try to fight inflation.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the cost of essentially that monetary tightening that has come very, very quickly. Obviously, we know that the Bank of Canada and many other central banks were expecting that we would see a troubled economy for a much longer period of time. I don't think they were expecting that inflation. Certainly early on, even in late 2021, most of the discussions from the central banks were that inflation was going to be transitory and not too concerned. But here we are, fast forward to March of this year, and both in Canada and the U.S., we started to see that, oh my gosh, inflation is really taking hold. We need to fight this. And we've seen those short-term rates come up very, very quickly. Possibly we're going to hit over 4% with the next announcement from the central bank in December.
Mm-hmm. So what impact does this then have? You reference it very quickly in terms of government revenues, because I wonder the impact, because I also take it that the government, not only looking at its revenue situation, must now decide if it will actually, cover the loss that's being posted by the bank?
Well, I think the federal government will likely have no choice. This is what has flowed into the federal government's kind of revenue stream over the last decades. Now there's an outflow, and I think the federal government will have to deal with it. Certainly when we look at what's happened, what inflation has done to the federal government's books, it's actually a positive. As you know, federal and provincial governments take a share or a certain portion of our nominal income. And so if inflation comes up, that tends to drive up nominal income, and it drives up government revenues. And this is what we're seeing across the board from the federal economic update, a lot of the provinces are doing better than expected. There's some of that, of course, is raw material prices and oil prices that have recovered, but a lot of that as well is due to these kind of higher inflation. So, obviously there's a cost here to the bank. High inflation is costly to the Bank of Canada, but it's been in some ways a benefit in terms of the net revenues for federal government. So I think they'll have to offset this, and essentially cover those losses.
Now, of course, as you know very well, Tiff Macklin, the Bank of Canada, has been criticized in recent months, especially considering how quickly it has raised interest rates to try to take on inflation. We now have this loss being posted after the Trudeau government, at least, has been criticized for spending as much money as it has. So Tiff Macklin says there will probably need to be a review of the kind of tools that was used by the Bank of Canada at the start of the pandemic. Do you think that makes sense? What exactly would you be looking for if you were going to review the actions, given not only the loss, but now the situation that this country finds itself in?
Yeah, I think obviously every time we see an economic cycle, economics is not a perfect science. It's not at all like physics. Every time we think we understand how the economy is going to work, things change on us just enough to keep us guessing. But obviously, what we faced during the pandemic, again, was, something nobody could have planned for. And I think the response, both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy, was essentially appropriate and was, in the face of so much uncertainty, something we needed to do. Where you could criticize a little bit is as we started to close the gap on the economy over the second half of 2021, and certainly at the beginning of this year, I think both federal and monetary policy weren't really catching up to the reality. And the reality was that we were moving from an economy that was in excess capacity to one that was in excess demand. We were no longer, especially with respect to labor markets. So we were above our capacity. We were no longer able to deliver. Demand was too strong. The support programs had been generous. Interest rates had stayed low for such a long time. Housing markets had taken off. People were looking to purchase not only home furnishings and housing, but other durable goods, and we just couldn't furnish all of that. Essentially, I think that's where we could have seen a little more action earlier on from both, federal and provincial fiscal policy, but also we could have seen the monetary tightening coming in a little quicker or a little earlier. Having said all that, though, we're in the situation we're in right now, and that is that, we are seeing, I think, the effects of much higher rates now starting to slow the economy, starting to ease consumer demand. And I think there's some good news, especially coming out of the U.S., with respect to where core inflation is at. So hopefully we'll see that soft landing scenario.
Well, we certainly are watching. Pedro Antunes, thank you very much for the time today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
And that is our program. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.